The supermarket parking lot was almost empty that Tuesday morning when Elliot Voss heard the sound. It wasn't a loud noise. It was exactly the opposite, a strange silence that opened in the middle of the place's normal movement, as if the air had frozen for a second. And then came the muffled crying. The kind of crying a child makes when he has already learned that crying loudly only makes everything worse. Elliot stopped. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped. 46 years old, gray hair at the temples, dark suit on a day when nobody wore suits. President of a holding company with operations in 4 countries, schedule packed until the end of the month, driver waiting outside. He wasn't used to stopping. But he stopped. Between the shelves in the cereal aisle, there was a woman bent over a boy about 8 years old. She held his arm with a force that turned her own fingers white. Her face was red, lips pressed tight, voice coming out in whispers that cut deeper than screams. The boy didn't move. He was completely still, eyes fixed on the floor, as if he had learned that the slightest reaction would turn the situation into something worse. Elliot stood still for 3 seconds. 5. 10. 2 other customers passed through the aisle. One glanced to the side. The other pretended to examine a package of oats. A supermarket employee adjusted products on the back shelf and looked away with the efficiency of someone who had seen that before and had already decided it wasn't their problem. The boy lifted his eyes for a fraction of a second. Just for a fraction. But it was enough for Elliot to see something that never leaves the mind of someone who notices it, an expression that should not exist on the face of an 8-year-old child. It wasn't exactly fear. It was resignation. It was the look of someone who no longer expects anything to change. Elliot took a step forward. The woman noticed his presence and abruptly released the boy's arm, as if she had been caught doing something, but at the same time with the posture of someone who didn't think she had done anything wrong. She was tall, hair carelessly tied back, clothes that had seen better days. There was something in her eyes, not pure cruelty, but a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and a hardness that forms when someone has spent years without receiving any kind of kindness and has forgotten how it works. "Can I help with something?" Elliot said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement wrapped in the shape of a question. The woman stared at him for a moment, evaluating him. Then she grabbed the boy by the wrist, less forcefully this time, but still firmly, and walked toward the checkout without saying a word. The boy passed Elliot with his head lowered. But at shoulder height, for less than a second, the child's step hesitated. Just hesitated. And that hesitation stayed engraved in Elliot Voss with a precision he couldn't explain. The boy's name was Caio. Elliot found that out 3 days later, without planning to. He went back to the supermarket, told himself it was because of the coffee he always bought there, which was partially true, and carefully asked the manager about the woman and the child. The manager sighed with the naturalness of someone who knew the answer by heart. Caio Drummond. 8 years old. Lived with his mother, Vera Drummond, in a house on the back street, 3 blocks away. The mother worked when she could find a job, drank when she couldn't, and sometimes drank even when she could. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. Nobody had done anything. "It's complicated, you know," the manager said, as if the word complicated could explain 3 years of collective silence. Elliot left the supermarket with the coffee in his hand and stood on the sidewalk for a time he couldn't measure. There was a question he couldn't push away, not about Caio, not yet. It was a question about himself, about the kind of man he had become over the last few years, about how many times he had passed by things that required him to stop and simply didn't. That question didn't have an easy answer, but it had a next step. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us in the comments what you thought and which city or country you're watching from. Vera Drummond's house was the kind that ages faster than it should. The paint peeled off in long strips near the windows. The wooden fence in front had 2 broken sections that nobody had replaced. The yard, if it still deserved that name, was a rectangle of dry dirt with a hose coiled in the corner and a forgotten plastic toy that the sun had faded until it lost its original color. It was impossible to tell what it had once been. Elliot didn't go there immediately. First, he watched. Not invasively, not in a way that could be misunderstood. He simply started paying attention to what had always been there. He drove down the street early in the morning, before work. He saw Caio leaving for school with his backpack hanging from one shoulder, always in a hurry, always alone. No goodbye at the door. No mother appearing at the window. The child disappeared around the corner as if leaving a place he needed to escape from. In the afternoon, the picture changed. Vera came home around 4, sometimes earlier, depending on the day. When she entered, the house became quiet in a different way. Not the empty silence of absence. It was a tense silence, the kind that exists when someone inside a place is trying not to be noticed. After 3 weeks of observing, Elliot didn't need to see everything to understand everything. There were marks on Caio's arm that appeared and disappeared. There were days when the boy arrived at school earlier than necessary and only returned home when it was almost dark. There was an elderly white-haired woman in the house across the street who sometimes stood on the porch looking at the road with an expression that mixed concern with helplessness, and whenever her eyes met Elliot's, she looked away as if she had been caught doing something wrong. On a Saturday morning, Elliot approached her. Mrs. Clea was 72 years old, with a firm voice and hands that never stayed still while she spoke. She knew exactly who Caio was, exactly what happened in that house, and exactly why she had never called anyone. "I already called once," she said. "About 2 years ago. They came, talked to her, and left. A week later everything was the same. And she found out it was me. It wasn't good." There was exhaustion in that sentence. Not indifference, exhaustion. The difference mattered. Elliot asked about Caio's father. Mrs. Clea shrugged with a specific kind of weight. "Disappeared when the boy was 3. Send money? Never. Show up? Even less." Vera Drummond was not a monster from a simple story. Elliot understood that little by little, the way people understand things when they truly pay attention instead of looking for confirmation of what they had already decided to think. She was 34 and looked 45. She had grown up in a house just like that one. Mrs. Clea knew that and told him without being asked, as if that information helped explain something she herself was still trying to process. Vera's mother had been harsh in the same way. Her father had left when she was little. She had started working at 14, stopped studying at 15, and gotten pregnant at 26 by a man who promised to stay and didn't. None of that justified what was happening to Caio. But it explained why Vera couldn't see what she was doing, because nobody had ever shown her a different version of what it meant to take care of someone. She repeated the only model she knew with the unconscious conviction of someone who doesn't know another path exists. Elliot sat in the car for a long time after that conversation, hands on the steering wheel and the engine turned off. There was one specific thing he couldn't get out of his head. Not the brutality of the moments he had witnessed, not the expression of resignation on Caio's face, but something smaller and therefore more disturbing. The previous afternoon, he had seen the boy sitting on the back doorstep with a notebook on his lap, drawing, completely absorbed, for maybe 20 minutes, until Vera appeared and said something that made him close the notebook immediately and go inside. 20 minutes of peace. That was all that child could manage. Elliot pulled his phone from his pocket and called Renata Souza, the best family law attorney he knew. She answered on the second ring. "I need to understand how the process of reporting child abuse and temporary custody works," he said. "In detail. Everything." There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "Elliot," Renata said carefully. "Are you okay?" "No," he replied. "But I think that's exactly why I'm calling." Renata Souza had a way of explaining difficult things without removing the difficulty from them. That was rare. Most people, when faced with a complex problem, tend to simplify it to the point where the solution seems obvious and the person asking the question seems naive for not having thought of it before. Renata didn't do that. She laid everything on the table with the same cold clarity of someone who respects the intelligence of the person listening and also respects the reality of the problem. The reality, in this case, was complicated. An anonymous report to Child Protective Services is the first step, she explained during a meeting that took place the following afternoon in her office. But a report alone guarantees nothing. They investigate, make visits, talk to the mother. If she downplays it, and she will downplay it, the case can be closed within weeks. And temporary custody? For a third party with no family connection? Renata spread her hands over the table. It's possible, but the road is long. You would need to demonstrate immediate and proven risk, have a documented history of neglect or violence, and even then face resistance from the system, which tends to prefer keeping the child with a biological family whenever there's any room for it. Elliot listened to everything without interrupting. How long? If everything goes well, months. If it goes badly. She paused. Longer. There was an unspoken question hovering over the entire conversation. Why are you doing this? And Renata didn't ask it, which Elliot interpreted as a form of respect. Or maybe she already knew the answer and didn't need to confirm it. It starts with the report, he said. It starts with the report, she agreed. The report was filed that week. Documented, detailed, with dates and specific descriptions of the episodes Elliot had directly witnessed. Renata guided every word. It couldn't be vague. Vague was easy to ignore. It needed to be concrete enough to demand a response. While the formal process began to move with the characteristic slowness of institutional machinery, Elliot did something else. He started building a case file. Not in the dramatic way that word suggests. It was something more patient, more methodical. He hired a social worker named Dr. Ivana Ferraz, a specialist in child abuse cases, and asked her to document everything that could legally be documented. Conversations with neighbors willing to speak, records of Caio's medical visits over the past years, which existed, and said things between the lines that a trained eye knew how to read, and a detailed report on the conditions of the house and the child's routine. Mrs. Clea agreed to give a formal statement. It cost her 3 days of hesitation and one night that she herself described as "I barely slept." But on the morning of the 4th day, she called the number Elliot had left and said, "You can put me on the list. I should have done this a long time ago." What Elliot hadn't anticipated was how much this process would affect him. There were nights when he stayed in his home office after midnight, reading Dr. Ivana's reports with a concentration that wasn't professional. It was personal, although he resisted admitting that even to himself. There was something in the details of Caio's daily life that he couldn't treat with distance. The child woke up alone. Prepared his own breakfast, when there was something to prepare. Went to school wearing whatever clean clothes he could find. Came back, did homework on any available surface, and spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of deliberate invisibility, trying not to take up too much space inside his own house. 8 years old. And he had already learned that existing less was safer. Elliot had a framed photograph on the shelf in his office. His ex-wife, Beatrice, taken on a Sunday morning at a beach in the south. She had died 4 years earlier, quickly and without warning, the way the most brutal things happen. Since then, he had built a functional and empty life with the efficiency of someone who knows how to manage loss but no longer knows what to do with presence. Looking at Caio's reports, he thought about Beatrice for the first time in months without feeling the usual weight. He thought about what she would say. She probably wouldn't say anything. She would just look at him with that specific expression that meant you already know what you need to do, so stop asking. In the 3rd week of the process, something happened that Renata had not predicted. Child Protective Services visited Vera's house and, during the intervention, she reacted violently enough that the agents had to call the police. Caio was removed from the house that night on an emergency basis and taken to a municipal shelter. Renata called Elliot at 11 o'clock that night. The process accelerated, she said. The window to request temporary custody opened. But you need to decide now if this is really what you want, because from the moment we file the request, there's no halfway point anymore. Elliot remained silent for a few seconds. Not out of hesitation. Like someone who had already made the decision a long time ago and was only letting the real weight of it finally settle. File the request, he said. The municipal shelter was located in a neighborhood Elliot had never had a reason to visit. It was a functional building, neither ugly nor beautiful, the kind built to serve a purpose and not to make anyone feel good. The interior walls were a faded sand color. The smell was disinfectant and reheated food. The children moving through the hallways had a particular way of carrying themselves, neither restless nor apathetic, but something in between, as if they were constantly calculating the environment around them. Elliot was allowed a supervised visit while the custody request was being processed. Caio was sitting at a table in the back of the common room when he walked in. He had a pencil in his hand and a sheet of paper in front of him, but he wasn't drawing. He was staring at the blank page with the expression of someone who had lost the thread of a thought and wasn't sure when it had happened. When he saw Elliot, he didn't show immediate recognition. Then something passed through his eyes. Not joy, not fear, but a kind of cautious attention. The kind of attention a child develops after learning that new faces can mean anything. Elliot pulled out a chair and sat on the opposite side of the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stayed there, without forcing a smile, without adopting the slightly artificial tone adults use when they don't know how to communicate with children. "You like drawing," Elliot said. It wasn't a question. Caio looked at the blank paper. "Sometimes." "What do you draw?" A pause. Houses. Trees. Sometimes dogs, but dogs are hard to do right. Dogs are hard, Elliot agreed. It was a small conversation. It lasted maybe 20 minutes, moving through unimportant subjects with the care of someone crossing an old wooden floor, testing each plank before placing weight on it. At the end, when the supervisor signaled that the time was over, Caio picked up the pencil and wrote something in the corner of the blank page. He folded it and pushed it across the table without looking up. Elliot waited until he had left the building to open it. It was a dog. Poorly drawn, crooked legs, uneven ears. Underneath, in the handwriting of a child still discovering the size of his own letters, "This one is easy." The hearing took place on a Thursday morning. Renata had prepared everything with the precision of someone who knows every detail of the ground she's about to step on. The case file was complete: Dr. Ivana's reports, Mrs. Clea's statement, medical records, the history of the Child Protective Services visit, and the incident that led to Caio's removal. Every piece was in place. Vera Drummond arrived with a public defender and an expression Elliot couldn't easily read. It wasn't anger, or it wasn't only anger. There was something beneath it that he recognized as the expression of someone who is afraid but no longer knows how to show fear without turning it into something else. The judge was a woman with short hair and an even voice who read the documents with an attention that left no room for interpretation about what she was thinking. Renata presented the case with surgical precision. She didn't appeal to emotion. The facts were eloquent enough. 3 years of records. A consistent pattern. A child who arrived at school with marks and left it afraid to go home. Vera's lawyer tried to build an argument about mitigating circumstances, financial hardship, the absence of institutional support for vulnerable mothers. None of it was untrue, and none of it was enough. The judge took 40 minutes to return with the decision. Temporary custody granted. Initial term of 6 months, with re-evaluation. Vera would have the right to supervised visits, conditioned on the immediate start of psychological counseling and treatment for substance dependency. Renata didn't celebrate. She simply closed the folder and looked at Elliot with an expression that said next step. Caio arrived at Elliot's house on a Friday afternoon carrying a small backpack and a silence that occupied more space than any object. The house was large, perhaps too large for 2 people, Elliot thought for the first time as he opened the door. He had bought the property years earlier with Beatrice, during a period when the future had seemed like something expansive. Since her death, the rooms had gradually lost their purpose. Some doors stayed closed not for any specific reason, but because opening them required an intention he didn't have. Caio stood still in the entrance hall, looking down the corridor ahead. "You can come in," Elliot said. The boy took a step. Stopped. Looked around with that calculated attention Elliot had already learned to recognize. Not admiration, but evaluation. Looking for exits, perhaps. Or looking for threats. "Which one is my room?" Caio asked. "Come on, I'll show you." The room had a window facing the garden. Elliot had asked for a new bed, a desk, and a bookshelf that was still empty. Simple, without exaggeration. He didn't want it to seem like an attempt to impress. Caio stood at the doorway for a moment. Then he walked in, went to the window, and looked outside. "There's a big tree," he said. "There is. Can you see it from here in the morning?" "All day if you want." Caio stayed silent for a while, a silence Elliot didn't interrupt. Then he turned around and asked, with a seriousness that didn't match 8 years old but made perfect sense coming from him, "When are you going to send me away?" The question hung in the air. Elliot looked directly at the boy and answered with the only thing that was true and that he was certain he could keep. "I won't." The first week was the hardest, not for the reasons Elliot had anticipated. He had prepared himself for crises. For nighttime crying, for rejection, for behaviors difficult to manage. He had read enough about childhood trauma to know that healing is not linear and that affection does not fix what years of damage create. He was prepared for the storm. What he wasn't prepared for was Caio's functional silence. The boy woke up before everyone else, made his own bed with a precision no 8-year-old child should have, and sat in the kitchen waiting without asking for anything. On the first morning, Elliot came downstairs and found him like that, back straight, hands on the table, looking out the window with a patience that was painful to witness. "You could have gotten something to eat," Elliot said. Caio looked at him. "I didn't know if I could." That sentence stayed with Elliot for days. They established a routine without formalizing any rules. The routine simply emerged, the way things emerge when two people begin occupying the same space with good intentions. Breakfast together. Elliot taking Caio to school. Dinner at 7, always. Weekends without a rigid schedule, which at first made Caio slightly anxious. He functioned better when he knew what to expect, and little by little became his favorite part of the week. Dr. Ivana continued following the case. Caio started seeing a psychologist named Dr. Fernanda, who had the specific gift of not seeming like a psychologist while she was working. The sessions took place in a room with colorful cushions on the floor and no desk between them and the child, and Caio came back from them slightly lighter, as if he had deposited something heavy in a safe place for a few hours. 3 months after Caio arrived, something happened that Elliot didn't expect. It was a Sunday afternoon. He was in the office answering emails with the door half open when he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Not the sound of a problem, but the sound of activity. A pan. Water. The specific sound of someone opening and closing cabinets with purpose. He went to look. Caio was standing with his back to the door, balanced on a small stool he had dragged to the stove, trying to make scrambled eggs with the absolute concentration of someone carrying out a mission of great importance. There were eggshells on the counter. There was an oil stain on the stove. There was a small and completely honest mess spread across the workspace of a child trying to do something on his own for the first time. "I'm making breakfast," Caio said without turning around. "For both of us." Elliot stayed at the doorway. "Can I help?" "You don't need to." A pause. "But you can stay here if you want." Elliot pulled out a chair and stayed. The eggs turned out imperfect, a little dry, slightly salty. They ate without commenting on it. In the middle of breakfast, Caio looked up with an expression Elliot was still learning to decipher. It wasn't exactly happiness, but it was something in that direction. "Was it good?" Caio asked. "It was great," Elliot said. And it was true. The review hearing took place 6 months after the first one. Vera had fulfilled the conditions. Not perfectly, not without relapses, but there was a real documented effort that Dr. Ivana acknowledged with the honesty of someone who doesn't distort facts in either direction. The supervised visits had happened. Some had been difficult. One had ended early, for reasons the report described in technical language and that Caio described to Dr. Fernanda with simple and precise words. The judge listened to everything. Permanent custody was granted to Elliot. Vera did not appeal. There was something about that absence of appeal that Elliot thought about for a long time afterward, not as a victory, but as something more complex. Maybe Vera also knew, in the place where people know the things they cannot say, that Caio was in a better place. Maybe that was the hardest thing she had ever accepted in her life. 10 years later, on a November afternoon, Caio Drummond walked onto the stage at his graduation as the top student in his class. He was 18 years old, broad-shouldered, with the same calculated attention in his eyes, but transformed now into something different. It was no longer the vigilance of someone searching for threats. It was the observation of someone who had learned to read the world carefully because the world once demanded that from him, and who had discovered that this ability, in the right place, became strength. He spoke for 7 minutes. Most of the speech was about choice. Not about destiny, not about luck, about the specific choice a person makes when they decide not to look away. He didn't mention Elliot's name at any point in the speech. But at the end, before stepping down from the stage, he looked directly toward the row where Elliot was seated and said, "There's someone here today who once stopped when everyone else kept walking. I wouldn't have made it here without that. I hope everyone here has someone like that. And I hope everyone here becomes that person for someone else someday." The audience applauded. Elliot didn't. He sat there with his hands resting on his lap and his eyes closed for a few seconds, letting the weight of that moment settle without rushing it. Then he opened them, watched Caio walking down the steps of the stage, and thought about Beatrice for the first time that day, not with the usual pain, but with something close to gratitude. As if she had somehow been part of making that day exist. Caio crossed through the audience and sat beside him without saying anything for a while. Then, the eggs that morning were terrible. Elliot laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes out without warning. "They were awful," he agreed. "But you said they were great." "I know." Caio looked ahead. "Thank you for that too." A single action can completely change someone's path. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real, and it has to happen at the moment when it's easiest to keep walking. Tell us in the comments what you thought of this story and which city or country you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and like the video, it helps much more than it seems.